How is everybody this afternoon? Good. We thought we'd get the room as warm as we could get it. Just a perfect time of the afternoon to keep you all alert. And so, anyhow, my name is Brian Becker from the Chicagoland area. I'm a consultant for about half my adult years, working primarily with nonprofits on planning, board development, strategy. I'm a certified executive coach, and I also serve on 2 boards right now, faith-based boards, and I'm chairing both of those boards. And so I'm bringing the perspective of consultant and board chair. And this is?
But the real story about Brian is this. Since I was his college best friend, if you really want to know about Brian, come see me afterwards. We don't tell those stories anymore.
I got a little nervous there, Chris.
I'm Don Christian, president of Concordia University, Texas. Board member in different board organizations. Work very closely with other boards, but for 9 years have been leading a board at Concordia and bringing some best practices to that area of how you work with boards to help them do the best work they can do over time.
Very good. So let's just get a little temperature of how many of you are on a board or council right now? Whoa, almost the whole room, okay. How many of you are board chairs or council chairs? Handful. How many of you are senior pastor? Again, many of you. Executive director, okay, and probably a few others as well. So, well, thanks for coming today. Don and I have had 2 really long conversations about what we wanted to talk about today, and we'd like to help you give us direction as to what would make this most valuable for you. So we want to give you just like 30 seconds to think about what would make this session most valuable for you. If you could take 1 or 2 things away from today, it would make it worth your time that you've invested here.
What are you really looking for from this, right? Yeah.
What are you really looking for today? What would be most helpful for you? So just take a moment to reflect on that, and then we'll learn a little more about that.
Thinking for myself.
By the way, there are 2 empty chairs up here if anybody wants to come in and...
Is it recording?
It is recording, yes.
Thanks, Ricky.
I didn't see him. There you go.
We got 1 more chair, going for 10, 15, do I hear 20? All right, next step.
Next step, just with 1 or 2 other people, share what it is that you most hope to get from the session today. What is it that you most came here for? And then we will listen to you. So just take
Turn to your neighbor.
2 minutes, but no more than 3 in a group.
That's Josh. He leads was a church plant, now a church in Leander, just north of us. Part of the Acts Network.
Okay. I looked at the list of people, and somebody from the big congregation in Bergdorf. I don't know who he is, but he's in the room. So he could be here.
So you talking to Dave Fiedler?
Yeah.
I gotta be careful what I say. Our friend Lois?
Yeah. She goes, I really don't need to know any of this, but I didn't like any of the other sessions, so she thought this might be fun.
If that's what they want, we'll give it to them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're gonna have to get groups of 4 or just...
No, let's just listen.
You're going to write some things down?
Yeah. Wait, that's our
Good call. These guys are ready. Look at it. They're ready to go.
Okay.
I don't know that name. That's right. Oh, I talked on the phone.
Come together, please. So, what would make this most valuable for you? met a new friend, they shared something really insightful with you. So what would make this valuable for you? Yes?
Keeping the board focused on the main goal.
Keep the board focused on the main goal.
Getting willing volunteers to help with the ministry.
Willing volunteers, okay, yes?
Avoiding kind of a groupthink mentality, diverse opinions rather than rubber stamp.
Okay, avoiding the group thing, rubber stamp.
Bible-based board.
How to get a Bible-based board, okay?
Training board chairs.
How to train board chairs, okay? Yes?
Building relationships and trust.
Building relationships and trust, Matt?
Moving organizational boards through their life cycle from like starting up friends and family board, moving into more professional governance.
How do you mature the board from startup into more? Okay, very good. Other burning issues, thoughts?
Bringing more participation,
More participation?
which adds to the diversity.
Yeah,
How to deal with people on your boards that have personal agendas.
how to deal with personal agendas. Okay.
Whoa, that got a big response. Did you love that? That's fantastic. We could probably spend the whole next hour on that.
Okay, last one.
Dysfunctional relationships between board members and staff.
Dysfunctional relationship between board and staff, okay. Well, this session is supposed to go until about 11:30 tonight. We'll cover most of that. So, lost my. So we promised that we were going to talk about 7 principles, and Don and I talked through all of this morning, and we've decided that we may or may not. But really, what we'd like to do is have a conversation, take questions, sort of interview each other. Don very much looks at his board and how do you deal with them through policy and policy development. And I very much look at my consulting work more about how do I work with the board using best practices. And so there'll be sort of a mixture of those things.
Don't you think, Brian, that those two ideas, best practices and governance form, right, answers a lot of these questions? When you
yes,
actually
absolutely.
do them, when you bake in best practices, when you have the right form or style of governance for your organization, whatever that is, and stick to it, these get answered.
Yeah. By the way, this is not a session today to talk about some of the big governance things that have been happening at Concordia University, Texas. But the board and Don have learned an awful lot in the last couple of years, so I'm sure you're going to hear some tidbits about that. But there is going to be another session later if you want to learn
Tomorrow at 4.
if you want to know more about some of the governance things that have been happening at Concordia University, Texas. So it's all about the leaders.
Yeah, I love this idea of caring for self first, and it's so true. I don't know if we'll get to the dynamic to it. Whether that's the board chair, or whether it's executive director, senior pastor, CEO, when you gotta be ready for the board, right? We have 4 board meetings a year. Some of you probably have 12 board meetings a year, right? And we have 4, each goes 8 to 10 hours, but 12 going maybe 1, 2, sometimes maybe more, they're exhausting times. And so I make sure, Brian, that I am ready for board meetings. Physically, mentally, spiritually. What has to happen the 2 weeks before, the week before, the 3 days before, the day before, the morning of. Because if I'm not ready, the board doesn't get the best of me.
Yeah, and when I'm chairing the board, some of you know of an organization called Lutheran Summer Music, 4-week Summer Music Academy. I've been on that board for about 6 years, and I've been chairing it the last 2 years. And what happens between me and the executive director of the organization coming into that board meeting is really, really important that he and I that's that dynamic duo, that he and I are on the same page. What does he need from me? How can I best lead the meeting? Because you can be a board chair and know enough about the organization, but lead deadly boring meetings. And so how do you make sure that how you structure that and care for each other going into that, you're ready for that. So.
I think Brian talked about that relationship, the dynamic duo. these two ideas of Bible-based and building trust. I have never done this, so this is Don Christian thinking off the top of his head, which may or may not be best thought, but I think it is, that there needs to be I'll call it a spiritual relationship between the board chair and the senior pastor, executive director. And most important relationship you have should be your board chair. It is the number one relationship I have with my board and my board chair. Because if that doesn't work, nothing else works. So how do we deeply bake in, especially in a church setting, where I bet oftentimes board chairs kind of rotate, and pastors rotate too, right? And to ignite that relationship with prayer, through study, through deep work together, maybe having a coach for the two of you, especially if there's not trust. I believe that's very Bible-based, because you put God in the middle of that in a very intentional way that changes that. Because if you're not on the same page with your board chair, if you're a senior pastor and your board chair are doing this, it would be, I can imagine it'd be hell, right? If you're a CEO, and if you're a board chair and you're not on the same page with the executive director, it's going to be hell.
So, by the way, we're using the term board, but substitute council, substitute committee, whatever it happens to be, because they're volunteers, they're elected usually, they usually have term limits, they usually have bylaws, and that sort of, so that all that functioning is very, very similar, and they are volunteers. And so, and a really interesting dynamic in that if you have a legal structure like a 501c3, most of you do, the board is the CEO's boss, and the CEO manages all the relationships, all the material, all of the pace of that. So it's this weird dynamic, like a rubber band stretching back and forth. And so if the relationship is not strong and trusting, that really affects so much of what can or can't work. I use the term anchor.
Yeah, before you leave that idea, one of my new paradigms that I use with boards and CEOs is the senior pastor and president always has to be ahead of the board and never too far ahead of the board. If you're too far ahead of the board and lose the board, it's over for you.
The board will never go fast.
Right. So, but you better be ahead of the board all the time.
Yeah. And if they meet once a month, well, I use the rubber band effect. You know, when you're in a meeting and people are listening and discussing, it's like that rubber band is like snapped you all together. You're all, thinking, like a good team, and then the board meeting ends, and then that starts to stretch apart. And for some of you, you don't meet but every 2 months or every 3 months. And so if there's not intentional communication back to the council or the board members, they end up emotionally in a very, very different space than you and perhaps your staff do, who are working together. I mean, with your executive team, you talk to them 10 hours a week.
Right.
And with your board, you talk to them 10 hours every quarter.
Right.
So, yeah. So, icebergs. This relates to this dynamics of we're not on the same page, it's not trusting.
Personal
Maybe
agenda.
there's some personal agendas, some dysfunction there. So you all know okay. So you've all seen the image of the iceberg. So when let's say we're all walking into the council meeting at Our Savior's Omaha, or I don't even know if there is an Our Savior's Omaha. So, but what's above the surface, we can see who's there on time, who's communicating, who's read their board docket materials. You have this sense of what's happening all above the surface. But what's below the surface of the water? Everybody brings all their baggage with them. Or unspoken expectations. Or frustrations about the fact that so-and-so got called and so-and-so didn't. Or maybe my wife has cancer, or there's some other thing going on and I cannot talk about this. So we're bringing all of these things below the surface of culture, beliefs, unspoken, maybe unmet, frustrations. Don, you told me the story this morning about one of your faculty members who came in and had a conversation with you, and then he came back a week later and he goes, I didn't really give you the whole story. And so what was way down here came up here.
So let's talk about how we can do that.
Yeah.
I believe every board meeting should have time for people to tell stories. How do you take, those of you who meet in the evenings, and a lot of church boards do, right? 7 o'clock, Monday nights, first Monday of the month, 7 to 10. imagine that volunteer coming in all day. They've been working, they've been hard, they probably went home, dealt with kids, family, rushed out to get there, and now you expect them to snap to it and be a great board. What happens during the first 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, to rub the, what do they call it, the amygdala? Let them play, let them laugh, let them talk about their life with each other. Don't just rush into it. We do, since we have all-day board meetings, Thursday night is always dinner, drinks, and a topic. And we sit around and we just talk and laugh and share stories, give them a vision of Concordia, keep them on the same page, right? The other thing is, so that's the group. You can't control the bottom of the iceberg, right? But you can create space for it to be revealed. So one, I think I told you this, so go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, if we were in this room 4 years ago, no one would have ever heard the term COVID, quiet quitting, January 6th, George Floyd, George Santos. You know, there's all of these, the reversal in workforce dynamics between power with the boss, now power, this huge percentage of people that are not even, quote, being counted in the workforce, and a huge percentage of people who are thinking about leaving their jobs. And so none of that was even in existence when we were here a couple of years ago. And so most of you are in a very important leadership position. And so you just powered through the last 3 years. And I'm guessing how many of you like say, I think I'm going to take a sabbatical now. So there's this expectation that you just sort of keep powering through. And I think there's maybe, I wouldn't maybe call it burnout, but a real sense of depletion in terms of how much we can just bring to the workforce. And so that caring for you, and then the people that you work with as well, many of them have experienced that same thing. So how we are coming back and reconnecting, really, so I think this time together to listen to the stories, guided, is just really important.
So let's talk about how hard this is, what it takes, and the courage of a leader, whether it's a board chair or a executive director or senior pastor, to unearth some of what's underneath the iceberg. So we began this journey of governance 18 months ago. Basically, the board said explore some things. We did. We had a meeting in September where we kind of laid out what this could look like, and then I knew that come our December meeting, we were going to go deeper into it. But I knew that the board was all over the place. They weren't ready. So I literally spent about 4 weeks, end of October, 1st of November, on the road across Texas, one-on-one with all 18 board members in their hometown or in their home or having coffee, 90 minutes. And I asked a series of 3 questions of everybody, and I just took copious notes. What it unearthed was what they were feeling, which allowed me to address what's underneath the iceberg rather than just what's on top. That took a lot of work, took a lot of energy, took a lot of courage to go into people's homes or places of work that I knew were a little, probably thought about this differently than I did, and ask them questions. But here's what they knew. They knew I wasn't doing one-offs. They knew I was doing every single board member in their hometown, and these were the questions I was asking. And they didn't have to worry about asking those questions later. They got an answer.
So really different dynamic than a brand new board, just barely getting off the ground. So, you know, if you think about a board in a nonprofit setting that's going from infant, toddler, adolescent, teen, you know, so you're on that, you know, mature organization with hundreds of employees and thousands of students and a $60 million budget, whatever. You know, if you got a 6-figure budget, you know, but still those dynamics of trust,
It's all there.
communication, storytelling, expectations, all that is still the same and equally as important. So,
Let's stop there.
yeah.
Thoughts,
Pause.
questions on anything we've said or done so far?
So we're a church plant going to be chartering at the end of December. So we're going from baby to toddler to...
Yeah.
We use a similar EOS style main agenda. So we begin the first 10 minutes, just headlines. So before I give my report as a pastor, the board gets to share things that are on your mind, things you've heard, things that you've been wondering to talk about. It's a free-for-all,
Cool.
but
Good.
we keep it down to 10 minutes-ish.
I like it. I like it very much. By the way, on the Huva, whatever the app is called, there are probably 10 slides for this workshop that we're not going to look at, but some of them are about like board maturation and recruiting and things of that nature. So feel free to look at those things. If you have questions about them, email me or Don, and we'd be happy to go more into depth on those things.
Are they gonna be available next week when we all get back to work?
I think they're there as long as you have the Whova app on your, because like I've gone to other events like months and months ago, and that stuff still all resides out there.
I do not see it right now. It's not there.
Really?
It's not.
We'll make sure we get it there,
Okay.
or
Yeah, I thought for sure I had posted it, so, okay, yes.
So on my national board, we have board meetings probably 3 times a year, maybe 4, where we travel to the board meeting, and they last probably 3 or 4 days. Because it's a big organization, but we get together at night, and the rule is we do not talk shop.
Oh, interesting.
We talk about families and anything
Okay.
else but what's going on in the board meeting.
Okay.
So you
And-
get to know everybody.
Yeah,
good.
okay.
Yeah.
You appreciate that?
You don't have those side conversations going on.
No,
You
everybody's
discuss it
in
as a
one
board.
group.
That's right.
Yeah,
Okay. Is it all women?
no,
Okay,
2 pastors,
okay.
which makes it
And-
really interesting.
You know. Other comments or questions? Okay, we'll turn the corner a little bit and talk about fiduciaries. So I had been on probably 4 or 5 different nonprofit boards, going back like 25 years, before I'd ever even heard the term fiduciary. And then somebody says, well, you realize that like, we have like this thing called D&O insurance. I'm like, I don't know what that is. What's that about? Well, you know, we don't own the nonprofit, but you're responsible for the nonprofit. And so like you can be sued or you're financially, I'm like, really? Okay, so I learned something that day. So I'm like, well, what does it mean to be fiduciary? So I'm not an attorney, but if I were one, somewhere here we go. There we go. In a nutshell, by the way, if this is something that's of high interest or concern to yours, you probably should have an attorney come in and talk to you and talk to your board, hour, 2 hours maybe, about the depth of what it means to be, if you're a 501c3 or some version of that, and you have a board of directors, you should have a board of directors, they have responsibilities, duty of loyalty, duty of responsibility or obedience, and duty of care, which means that their primary allegiance must be to your mission, your vision, your values. They should not have conflict of interest. Years ago,
Let me-
go ahead,
you know,
Don.
They might have a conflict of
They
interest.
might have a conflict
They
of interest.
cannot, they have to reveal their conflict of interest to you. I think people think, I can't be served on a board if I have a conflict of interest. You actually can be on a board if you have a conflict of interest. You just cannot, you have to make it
Shouldn't
known
conceal that.
and work through it, yes.
So let's say, for example, I'm on the board, and the board is going to build a new early childhood center, and my brother-in-law has a really good construction company, or as an engineer or something like that, architectural. So I'm like, oh, well, I want to get him in there for that business. So then my interest becomes for my brother-in-law, not for the organization. Now, if he wants to like make a bid, that's okay. But I probably should say that to the board, by the way, that's my brother-in-law. And then the board can say, okay, thank you for disclosing that. There may be other conflicts that come up where if I disclose that, the board might say, well, we are not comfortable with that. And we feel that you either need to get off of that group or resign from this board. So and that's pretty severe, but at least you want to get those things up and above board.
Absolutely. To this point, this is what keeps personal agendas out of the room.
Well, it could be that you simply don't have a vote.
You can choose not to vote on that too, yes.
Yes.
But these things, understanding this, because boards don't talk about this stuff. Our board had never talked about this until we brought it, and every year we review this. When we go through our mini training every year with current board members,
Yeah.
they've got to align with this. And that's, again, when you deal with tough issues, this is hard because people, if they love your organization and church boards, they love your church, right? I mean, they are there for a reason. And this is really hard. This is what gets below the iceberg.
Yeah.
And if somehow that's not revealed or you don't allow them to think about that, personal agendas will show up It will become very dysfunctional with board staff.
Yeah, it
And
can
all
become a
these
war
things.
of personalities.
So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
These three things need to be understood and talked about. What does it mean for that specific ministry in these areas? James?
Don, with that orientation of new members, how vital that is. I mean, I've been on enough boards where they hope you get it by osmosis by sitting there, rather than introducing them to the history, the values, the mission, and helping them to then fully be able to participate because they have that base of understanding.
You know, we were just talking about it earlier. Al, is it? Yeah. Been in policy-based governance for a year. And the fact is, nobody was born learning how to do policy-based governance, right? So the training on your form of governance, whatever that is critical. Because everybody's coming with how they believe a board should act. Because past experience, what they've seen on TV, what they've been on, you've got to determine, is this how we govern? And you have to fit into how this goes. So every time a new board member is nominated, we start talking to them, we begin with, we govern by policy. This is what that means. And if you can't do that, this is not a good board for you.
Just three little distinctions here. Duty of loyalty is about where the mission and the values of the organization are first and foremost. And as a board member or a trustee, I need to uphold that and understand that. Duty of obedience is like the laws of the state where you're chartered and the federal, you have bylaws. The federal government says you have to file a 990 and you're supposed to approve certain policies, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are legal things that you're supposed to uphold for the organization. And then duty of care. I mentioned that I'm on the board at Lutheran Summer Music. We have about $2 million in endowment. And so we're right now forming an investment committee because we just felt like we don't have enough expertise on the board to really be, I mean, we have fund managers that we pay to take care of that, but we've never really established a set of policies that align with the mission and the values of the organization. And that's where we're headed with that, because we just feel like as fiduciaries, we need to be more responsible, because it's wonderful donors that have helped us do that over the years, and we want to take good care of the assets of the organization. By the way, that's also the care for the people that work there, the volunteers, the people that are served, the reputation of the organization. And so you care for those assets of the organization.
Let's just talk about policy. You use the word policy. It may be coming up, and I want to touch on policy. A lot of boards just don't write policy. They may have a policy manual that they haven't looked at in 6 or 7 years. Have somebody on your board, if not you, be a policy wonk. You got to have people who love policy. I'm one of those people. I could hang out with policy all day long. Now, some people hate it, and I have board members who hate it. The fact is, good policy, prudent policy that is well written and well executed, keeps boards focused, helps avoid groupthink, builds trust, matures the board, creates more. I don't know about that. Personally, it depends what you mean by participation, and really gets rid of this dysfunction. So when something comes up and you have an issue between the CEO, pastor, and the board, the first question should be asked, should we write a policy about this? And if it's coming up once, it's probably going to come up again. And you want to keep people out of micromanaging? Write policy. Then you manage through policy.
Can I ask a question? So I've always thought of policy based of like, oh, we have bylaws that we go off of. Those are the policies. That's not what you're talking. So you explain what you mean by
So,
policy.
very good point. Too many boards have bylaws in which they write way too much, and that's their policy.
Yeah.
And you can't change bylaws quickly. You
Yes,
can't,
right,
but a policy manual. So your bylaws should say really how and why the organization exists, who serves as the president, who serves as the board, who serves.
Term limits, et cetera.
Policy manuals, now again, policy-based governance is a very strict way of doing that, but whatever form you follow, policy manuals talks about what you as the pastor are allowed or not allowed to do, how you and the board relate, how the board does its work together, and those get changed then as you come up against different things. But we are consistently reviewing and changing our policy manual. I don't think a meeting goes by that we don't come up to policy and have to look at it and probably change or write new ones. And as I see an end to my leadership in 3 to 4 years, I am now thinking what policies need to be in place so that whoever takes over for me can just sail right through and not make mistakes I made when I took over.
Last year, after this session, Don and I did a similar session, but was there another?
No, there is, but finish that thought.
Pastor came up to me and said, I have the greatest people on my council, and they just micromanage at every single meeting. They go deep into the weeds, and it's just driving me crazy. And I go, well, tell me about your governance. He goes, well, we have policy-based governance. I go, okay, well, how schooled and how well up to date are they on your policy? He goes, well, we haven't really taken it out of the drawer in about 6 years. He was not exaggerating. So what happens is you have a room full of people who are really caring, and some of them own their own companies or run a nonprofit in town, or they're the vice president or whatever. And they want to come and they want to help. And so without the right type of strategy in front of them on agendas, they'll problem solve. And they'll start getting their nose way down into the stuff that you and the staff really are there and paid to do. So they did 2 things that really have made, I stay in touch with them. I did a little bit of work for them this last year. One was they got the policy manual out, dusted it off, and they did some training on, oh, this is how we're supposed to govern ourselves here. It's not about governing the organization. It's about how do we guide our own board here. And the second thing is we just did some simple best practices, like what are some things you could do in order to strengthen the board. And one of them was they changed the way that they did some recruiting. And they were much more intentional about not starting with, oh, I know Susan or I know Fred. They'd be great on the council, wouldn't they? It was like, no, not who do we need. It's what do we need most next. And so they had more intentional, more intelligent conversations about policy and then recruitment. And that changed dramatically how those boards function and how the meetings went from being in the weeds to much more on the strategic level. So,
Question. He's writing something down. You said something really smart.
Well, earlier you were talking about writing new policy, and you guys are experts. I'm not arguing. I believe you're right, but there also needs to be some management of that. You can't just be writing new policy every time you turn around. It has to be well managed, or you don't have the trust.
That's right.
Because there's a new policy every time you turn around, and people don't trust the fact that there's a policy because it changes next month.
So let's talk about that for a second, because that's about how you write policy and think about it.
Okay.
We adopted on our board early on because people were bringing policies to the board meeting that we personally as staff didn't think about. So we said you can't just bring a policy to a board meeting.
Yeah.
What we do find is that, and this is again best practice, I believe. If a board member says, "Well, I don't like that you were using orange lanterns," okay? As the leader of the group, I would say to them, "Thanks for sharing. Appreciate it. Tell me why." And then I would look at the board and say, "Does the board feel the same way?" If the board doesn't feel the same way, then the issue's dead. A board member does not have control over me, right? The board has control of me. So as board members, if a board member says, we should do X, the board completely should say, does the board think we should do X? Get out from what's under the iceberg. Now, if the board says, you should never use orange lanyards, my job never to use orange lanyards, and whoever follows me, right? That now becomes policy. Because the board has stated it believes X about this organization. And nobody, and if it's not in policy, if I forget, or the person after me uses purple lanyard or uses orange lanyards again, the board's gonna say, we don't allow that. How would they know if there's no policy? So I agree, don't just willy-nilly, but don't be afraid to write policy either. Good point, thank you.
could you give us an example? We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but like of a real policy in the last year or so that's been
Oh gosh,
something.
yeah. Well, literally, just this last board meeting, we had about 7 years ago, as we were facing some financial issues, we wrote policy around budget and around end-of-year results on the operating statement. And so the policy was, the president shall not fail to deliver a budget of the board that is less than a 1% positive margin. Which is a good policy, right? You want to have cash at the end of the year. And I said, let's bake that in, so no way I have to do this. Also gives me leverage with my staff. When the board says X, I get to have leverage with other people. They also wrote a policy that said shall not fail to deliver an end-of-year statement of activities that has less than a 1% positive margin, which again is a good thing, right? Well, we've done great the last 4 years, and we now have cash in the bank. And as we face some of the COVID issues, and as we face abilities to pour cash now into operations, guess what we're going to have? A negative margin for 1 or 2 years. I couldn't do that with that policy, because in our policy, you don't make exceptions.
Right.
So we rewrote a policy that says the CEO is allowed to make exceptions to these two with a plan, letting the board know ahead of time, and with a plan of how it's going to turn around in 2 years. So that was taking a good policy and then rewriting something to allow that policy to have some
But you
flexibility.
put a curve on it,
We put a curb on it, yes.
2 years.
That's right.
You can't,
That's right.
not ongoing.
That is correct. And
Which
that's,
builds trust.
so it really, I got to tell you, good policy builds trust.
That also keeps them out of the weeds. Like, how come the marketing line is so big? Or what happened to that?
That's right.
They don't need to be.
Truth is, my board never votes on a budget. What they have done is set policy by which I have to write a budget, and then I hand it to them sometime before June 30th. And now if it's going to be out of policy, well, if it's ever out of policy, I would have to tell them or get it back into policy.
And-
Saves so much time.
And your board, don't they use your strategic plan as a way to evaluate you?
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that just for, because that's really foreign for a lot of people.
I'm trying to think how to answer that. So again, you want to keep the board out of the weeds. You want to keep them focused. First of all, have a strategic plan. It's well thought out, that's written, that's good for you, and you can deliver on. I have on my desk underneath glass 2 covers from 2 other universities that had fantastic strategic plans and closed 2 years after they wrote those plans. Reminder to me every day that a good plan is worthless if it doesn't solve the problem you need to solve. So I have to report all the time on my strategic plan. How are we doing? Here's the measures. How are we doing? What we're doing with it, and they're looking at the outcomes and how does the strategic plan align with what the board wants to have happen for the university. And I'm not sure they measure me directly on it, but
Okay.
if I'm not, a policy is shall not fail to have a strategic plan and shall not fail to report on a strategic plan.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a bit about how do you get the right people in the room? You know, the right people on the council, on the board, that sort of thing. Where are we? Relentless recruiting. So like that movie, The Right Stuff, remember that was like 30 years ago or whatever about the astronauts? You know, people just can't show up and say, hey, I think I'd like to be an astronaut. Okay, come on in. You know?
I tried that once, it didn't work.
So, and I have found, I probably worked with, you know, dozens and dozens of nonprofits of all sizes, of all ages over the last 20 years or whatever. And I see no correlation between the age of the organization and the sophistication of their board. Some of them are just drifting along from one time to the next, and others are very intentional about that. And part of that, a piece of that puzzle is how do you recruit? And some of them that aren't paying attention, they recruit like a bunch of room parents do at the local school. You know, I know Susan, she has a pulse, let's ask her to be on the board. And so, not a good idea. So the idea of saying, what do we need most in order for the board to be more effective at the way that it functions is, so you start with a what question. What do we need most? All right, and so I'm going to buzz through this real quickly. So this is sort of a generic version of what one of my clients uses, and so they don't have the who do we know conversation until they've had the what do we need conversation. So your list may look a lot different than this, but what are the type of things? So like with the Lutheran Summer Music Board, for example, we didn't have the financial acumen, and so we're really looking hard at what. The what part, the financial part of that is one of our next things that we're really concerned about, okay? Then once you get this refined, doesn't need to be that big or whatever, you know, for you, you know, you're looking to have a more biblically based group. So how do you find those spiritual leaders? Do you need a spiritual advisor? Do you need a pastor? Do you need a theologian? You know, that's a good strategic conversation for a board to have.
Yeah. We had that conversation actually just last meeting in December, where we said, given the makeup of our board, and we've got a lot of changes coming up in our April election, what is it you most believe this board needs? And it was fascinating. It looked a little bit like this, But it's spent way more time here. And that's what I would say, this is more important than this. Because especially if you have a more mature organization, mature board, mature leader, this is probably all being taken care of by the team and staff. We hire people to do this. Large organizations will have that, smaller will not.
Yeah.
But you want a great board member. And I say that's so true. They bring, again, you want to keep board focused on these things happening. Board members who can think strategically. I talk about bringing a capacity of strategic thinking, bringing a capacity of relationships. So think about the people sitting on the board in the congregation. Their relationships with others in that congregation are critical to achieve the strategic direction. And then capacity of resources.
Yeah.
And that could be time, that could be financial resources, that could be outside other resources they can bring in, but that capacity to really serve as a great board member and follow the rules of the board.
I had a client that I worked with for about 4 years, and when I first got connected, it was a fine arts organization in urban Chicago. Maybe 800 kids a month run in and out of this place and learn how to dance and act and do music, et cetera, et cetera. The executive director had asked dozens of people over a several-year period to join the board. 100% of them said no. 100% of them said no. And the more I got to know her, the more I realized that she was carrying like this negativity with her about nobody cares about us and very frantic and, oh, it's easy to be on our board. You know, we just meet, you just have to just show up on, well, somebody who really has their act together, they don't want to just show up. They want to be involved in something meaningful, something challenging, something worthwhile. And so they had a very large funder that actually said to them, your programming is so good, we love it, but your board is lame. And if you can't, they would like, listen to reports and rubber stamp over and over and over and over again. And said, if you can't fix this board thing, our funding is going to go away. And that would have been huge for them. So they literally asked all the board members except one, 17 of them, to resign. And they changed their bylaws so they could go down to 3. And they went into the community and looked hard for 3 people that knew how to rebuild a board. So everything that they were looking for those next couple of years was about rebuilding the board. And they found 3 people who said yes. And then once they got that, they said, now let's go up to 5. Now let's go up to 7. I think they have 11 on the board right now. And this changed at the end of each year, they went back. The other thing is they had no one on their list. So fast forward, that was 2018 when I started working with them. They now have a list, like a professional ball team. They have a list of about 30 people that they have their eyes on. They're like, if next time we need legal, we got 3 people. It's like, it's like, I was going to say the Cubs, but that might get too close to home.
They have a great farm system.
So they
team sucks, but they have a great farm system.
they know the next 7 shortstops. They know who's already on the list. You don't wait till the shortstop goes lame and then look for a shortstop. Okay, so they have this list of about 30. They start inviting them to events. They start taking them to lunch. They give them tours, and they start wooing people. Hang on to your question. We'll come to you. Go ahead.
I'm thinking in my head, working with church boards, councils, and having served on them. I served in the church for 7 years and helped run that council meeting and the whole organization. It's so different than kind of the nonprofits we work with, right? The people who serve on the board are the members you serve, which is really tough. I'm thinking out loud here. This is really critical for church boards. Who is it that you, as a senior pastor or a board chair, are really looking out there going, who is the next person to sit on this board? And how do we get them ready for that? And how do we talk about how great this board is? Our church that I was at part of Houston, we had transitioned just as I was leaving the church and moving to Austin to policy-based governance. And so I've watched this occur over the last 18 years. And they still struggle to get board members. It really is a warm body many times. I'm like, why is that? And I think it's because we don't manage church councils and boards. They don't see themselves as those fiduciaries. Again, think about the role that pastors typically play. I bet if you ask a typical person in the church about the org structure, I'll bet most of them, what would they put at the top? The pastor. And the truth is, that gets very dangerous, especially if you do have a board structure. There better be something else there, that board, pastor, now in policy-based government, board, pastor, and then the rest of the staff. In other base structure, it might look a little different, but the clarity around that, because again, if the board understands, this is my church, I've been elected, chosen by my peers, and we believe that happens through prayer and God's intervention and all that too. I believe that's for my board, to be the fiduciaries of this church. Lestro was in the back, still in the back of the room, was working with Trinity Houston, and we were looking for a new senior pastor after a 34-year pastorate and some bumps in between, and we got Les to help us write a strategic plan. And we kept asking the question, hire the pastor, call the pastor, and then have him help write the strategic plan, or write the strategic plan, then call the pastor to fit that plan. And it was, let's push, write the plan. You know why? Pastors come and go. Churches remain. And the mission and the strategy of the church always remains. And it was a brilliant idea. I'm glad we used you for that. I'm glad we followed your suggestions. By the way, if you ever need a consultant, Cornerstone Consulting, fantastic people, listen to everything they tell you. It actually works. A little commercial there, huh?
You had a comment or question?
Yeah, our board just went through a strategic plan, which there were a whole lot of changes, and it spent about a year going through that. And one of the reasons why we made the changes that we made is our board members were working more on the board than they worked for their careers.
Oh, gosh.
We were putting in 60 to 80 hours a week, and we were losing volunteers, and you can't do that.
No.
So we turned a lot of that skills over to our office staff and got rid of that, so you're not doing busy work. You're there for ideas.
Yeah.
You're there for planning. You're not there to tell somebody how to put on a Facebook post.
So, thank you. I think that's really important because you know, if you think of like 3 layers of, stratosphere or whatever in the clouds, I always have this image of like conceptual work in the highest clouds, the strategic work in the middle clouds, and then the tactical work on the ground. And it sounded like you have a board that was like focused on all the stuff that was on the ground, and now you've flipped that and you've moved them more into the strategic.
You were doing everything is the problem.
Yeah.
You weren't turning it over, the little stuff,
Yeah.
to someone else that could do it.
So as a director, executive director, or senior pastor, or whoever's running meetings and establishing agendas is super important, yes. So let's talk a little bit about engaging questions. Because Don and I both know a consultant, kind of a mentor to us, a guy by the name of Gary Hubbard, who has drilled into both of our heads that the quality of the questions you ask yourself will determine the quality of your life. The quality of the questions you ask your council or your board will determine the quality of their work or their outcomes. So, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, there's different type of work boards do. Some of it is tactical. They have to approve certain things, right? Those should be written down, what, when, and how. Then there is kind of the strategic, but the other word that's out there now that we use is called generative thinking. The generative work of boards. And that is really these big questions. And we make sure in our meetings, we chunk that out sometimes. Here's the board work that has to get done, and here's the things you do every month, right? And that's on the agenda. Another hour to an hour and a half will be strategy thinking. What are the questions that we're most struggling with that we need your thought on now, right? But the generative thinking is, here's what's in my head right now. What do you think about that? And we don't need to come up with an answer even. And this drives people crazy who want to solve problems, right? But just give me your best thing. Here's something to read this month. 2-3-page article. And then my hardest work is coming up with the question. Literally, I will spend 15, 30, an hour trying to determine the right question to ask. And I'll bounce it off my provost, probably bounce off my board chair. Because that question will shape the future of the board, and it really is very engaging for board members, right? They get to really talk about cool things, but you don't need an answer. But it's the quality of the question.
Don and I probably spent 10 minutes this morning discussing what would be the first question we asked you today. Because we didn't want you just to come in and just like go, where's this going to go? We wanted you to put in your own mind, what do I most want out of this? Because the mind becomes sort of like a heat-seeking missile. You know, if you put the question there, it will try to find that answer. It's like when you can't remember someone's name, like the next morning you wake up and you remember the person's name. So, question, comment.
Question. So I like the idea. My fear. How do you stop it from like you start asking questions that they all of a sudden they've got a bunch of good ideas that they want. Like, okay, now staff's going to go. Does that like? It's like how do you navigate that?
It's a clarity of what you're doing.
Okay.
You're doing generative thinking.
Okay.
You are not doing staff work.
Okay.
I need your best thinking on this. You may not even know much about the topic. I don't care. I need your best thinking. You're not doing strategic work.
Okay.
You're doing just thinking. And so I can make a whole list. I can take that, and I get to do with it what I want.
Okay.
And it's how you frame the question as well.
Yeah.
You're not looking for them to like design something that's going to happen on your campus or whatever.
So let me a question we asked 3 years ago, because it kept coming up, is to, in our situation, we had to ask the question, to whom does the board owe its fiduciary responsibility? Because literally, they were split between fiduciary responsibility to Concordia University, Texas, and a fiduciary responsibility to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. That was actually in the bylaws, still is in the bylaws. And the bylaws say you have fiduciary duty to both. You really can't. But they wrestled with this question. I gave them some information. Fantastic discussion. It really unearthed what was under the iceberg for some people. And it was a step towards what we had to do a year and a half later to have really deep conversation about what that relationship would look like. But there was no question asked that we should do X at that time. There's another question back there.
Yeah, big believer in the power of asking the right questions, asking good questions. Do you have resources, go-to things that help develop that aptitude? Or
Yeah.
how can you grow?
Go ahead.
So I have done a lot of look at something called appreciative inquiry. David Cooper writer, which basically, as a consultant, my job isn't to be an expert at what my clients do. My job is to be a great facilitator to move them forward. And so I'm constantly working with myself as the question asker to have them focused on framing accurately where they are. This is sort of that Stockdale paradox. You familiar with that? Where are we? What does it look like? And what do we want it to look like? And so between where we are, this isn't like looking back and did my dad mistreat me when I was a kid. It's not like counseling, okay? So where are we? More like good executive coaching. Where are we? But what do we want it to look like? Preferred future. And where's the energy in the organization? Where's the life in the organization? This is not problem solving. A quick example. So let's say that your church has a daycare, and there's a certain number of kids that are showing up late all the time, and it's so disruptive. So the question is, why are those kids always showing up late? So your mind goes to bad parenting, traffic, those kids nowadays. So the question just drilled me right into a problem versus staying, as a board, what might we do to create a culture where everyone shows up on time every day? And your mind goes a completely different direction than why do those darn kids always show up late? Okay, but now that takes a little bit of time to create a better question and to think about potential, to think about life. So that's the basis of appreciative inquiry.
It's really, again, write down those questions and in your mind say, is that question ambiguous enough to generate different answers? Don't ask a question you already know the answer to. I've lived by that as a teacher for years. Does it produce a little anxiety in people? Oh wow, we have to answer that. And there's a third one that I can't think of, but basically if it's got an answer, if it's problem solving, don't use it. Spend time on it. And test it with people.
We had a little argument this morning on the value of consensus. Whether or not we should even seek consensus. Is it okay for the board to have this tension in it and have disagreement in it? And then to speak with, by the way, when it comes to this recruiting and that, those lists are all confidential. You don't want that floating around the community that you're looking at these 30 people to be on the board or whatever. So just so that maybe that's another point about confidentiality. Yes.
So this might be a little too specific. When it comes to working board with the pastor or executive director, one position I've been hearing different voices on right now as we're forming our officers and board, the treasurer. Some say it's good to have a treasurer on the board. Others would say, since the senior pastor is the one, or the lead pastor is presenting to the board what the church and staff is doing with the finances, that role should be under the pastor or the COO if your church is large enough. So thoughts of, when it comes to your officers, specifically that treasurer, where does that fit in between working with the board, the pastor? That's a weird mix depending on.
It's a third person you don't want. It creates ambiguity, it creates unease. Who's in charge of the money, right? And I would say, there's no need for a treasurer. What's needed is policy by the board to ensure that the senior pastor CEO directs the treasurer to do the things that are needed, that the board can go, okay, we've trusted you. Because the treasurer, again, we just had that conversation, Al, right? You already a treasurer, based on Jim Galvin's work that he does with boards. So I don't see a need for a treasurer, personally.
On the board.
On the board.
And there's enough discipline systems and transparency that it's well explained and people understand where you are from a financial perspective. There were some other hands that,
It does not mean the board doesn't pay attention to finances.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a key too, if I may, just real quickly.
Sure.
Board members will typically say, I hear board members go, I'm not a finance person, I leave that to the accountant on the board. Every single board member, you don't have to read every note, but you should be able to at least look at some financial things and ask questions. And every board member should be reviewing the finances, even if they don't deeply understand it. So, still a responsibility without having a treasurer.
Hi, my name is Kendall Meyer. I'm the pastor at St. Paul Lutheran Church and School in Fort Dodge, Iowa. And so I wanted to ask you a question about number one. It's all about the leaders. I've been at this church for 3 years. And beforehand, there was a pastor there that was there for 20 years. And during the midst of those 20 years, even though there was a constitution and bylaws that had a term limit for those that were on the board or how long they could serve, they never followed those. And so now I'm coming into a congregation where many of the people that have been in their positions have been doing it for, some of them, 17, 18 years. And they're getting to a point where it's obvious that they're burned out, but they feel like they're the only ones that can do it. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how I might be able to move toward getting back to what our Constitution and bylaws say, in the essence of caring for the board and caring for those that are feeling like they're burned out, but they've always done this, like was something that was expected from the pastor. But how do I do that without them thinking I'm not in their corner and I don't want them on the board anymore?
My sarcastic side is you could get on the call list. That's not what you're looking for. You're there. So this would fall into what I would call the growing your garden, which is it hasn't been tended to. So there is policy. It's like think about your garden. You've got the plot. At one time there was a good garden there, and it's all gone to seed, and it's a mess right now. So expecting it to be a great garden next summer is unrealistic, but you can start. So where do you start? I think take it with a grain of salt, okay? So none of us paid to come here, so we all got ourselves. So I would start with.
You weren't paid? Jeff didn't offer you money? I'm shocked.
Oh no. Anyhow, I would go back to what do your bylaws say? Go back to that governance.
And what I would say with that is that's your legal duty. There is a charter and bylaws that it is not, shall think about following these. It must follow them. Otherwise, you really would threaten your 501c3 status. And that's what I would throw out. When I get to use accreditation as a hammer, right? I would use the legal issue as a hammer. These are our bylaws. We can't deviate from it. We have, and now we get to change. And
if they're 20 years old and you go through them and go, wait a second, this doesn't fit anymore, well, then you alter the bylaws. But use them as a way to help, long gospel. Guide yourself back to the path where you're supposed to
It
be.
is the beauty of policy and bylaws that keep people focused. And when people want to veer off, you get, no, this is what we said we were going to do. And that might be hard for some of them, but you've got the legal side on your back with this one.
And I would approach this from not we're a bad board,
Right.
but like how do we improve this? And what are some best practices? Just a couple of things we might do in the next 6 months that would help right the ship, get us going, more professional, more organized, more out of the weeds. And you know, sticking with the garden mentality, you know, it takes years and years and years to get a really great garden. And then if you let it alone for like half a season,
Yeah.
it's a mess, isn't it? And it's not hard to have a good board. It's not hard to have a good garden. You just have to stay on certain things, and a handful of things.
And Brian does a great job with best practices. I mean, you want, get the slide, or have him come and talk with you personally, or have him work with your board. Getting somebody to come in from outside sometimes may be the best thing you could do, right? Because the first thing a consultant's going to do is going to say, let me see your bylaws and policies. And then you start there, and you don't have to be the bad guy at all. I was looking down the list. I want to talk groupthink for a second. One of the ways to avoid groupthink is to make sure you get people talking. So you all probably have board members or are a board member like this that talks a lot, right? And there are some on the board, or you might be a board member that doesn't say much. I'm okay with that because people are internal processors, right? Some people are external processors. That's what they bring to the board. I don't ever feel like a board member is not engaged because they don't talk. They're engaged up here. But, I hate the word but, and the board doesn't get their best thinking. So I'll lean over to my board chair many times and say, it's time to go around the room. And that's what he does. Starts his left or right, or starts somewhere, and goes down the list, and we go around the room. What are you thinking? Don't need long speeches. We've heard from 5 people. I've got 12 people I haven't heard from in the last hour and a half. I need you all to speak. That is eye-opening. Because what you're doing is giving people permission to speak that may not feel they, again, with volunteers, sometimes they think, I don't know enough to speak. So you might have to say, I need you to speak. Just let us have them. It avoids groupthink. The other thing I would say is get in your phraseology and your board chair's phraseology. Tell me more about that. Where's that coming from, right? Because I don't want to use orange lanyards. Okay, say more about that because I don't see it, but I might be missing something. And that's a key to unearth again. I love that iceberg, which I haven't used that much, but I'm going to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and oftentimes it's the iceberg that keeps really well structured, well written strategic plans from really getting. You can have people in the room that all get going. We set great goals and great timelines and all that sort of thing, and then there's stuff unspoken expectations and that prevent people from really wanting to move things forward. So
let's talk about board chair training for a little bit. We haven't talked about that.
Sure,
why don't you talk about it? You've done a lot with that.
Board chair training. Sure.
That was the question.
So, as a board chair, I've never had board chair training personally. Okay, but I've been.
You have because you've served on boards.
I've served on 7 different boards and chaired a number of them. And with one of the organizations, I talk with the executive director every other Monday morning, and I do it more for him than for me. We're all working remotely. He's disconnected from his own staff, a lot of decisions. Our board, like all boards, you know, we move slowly, but he's got to move fast. So I focus with him on how's he doing. Let him tell his story about, you know, where is life right now with 2 little kids and thinking about letting one of the staff go and that sort of thing. So I help him think through those things. Then I also try to be my best dynamic duo with him on what's the next agenda need to look like for the board meeting. And so there are certain things that we have to do because it's, you know, we have to function and get certain things done. But he needs for me to run a really good meeting. And so what do you want me to lead on? You want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. When I talk to my board chair before meetings, we are doing exactly this. We go step by step. Who's taking lead? Who needs to do what? Does the board need to hear from me? Does the board need to hear from him? This idea of running a good meeting is not all about that you have to take care of everything. That's the staff again. but it is being able to sit in that space as a board chair
Yeah.
and hold the room, hold the tension in the room, right? Hold people accountable, and then know when it is to speak. My board chair, was a vice president of a bank. He's retired now. He's fantastic. He's the most soft-spoken, quiet guy, loves people, loves the church. But let me tell you, when he speaks, that room listens. And when he gets agitated, that room really listens, because it maybe happened twice in 5 years. Man. So you don't need a board chair who's running everything. You need a board chair who can hold that space really, really well.
And if you're the person who's running that meeting, it's almost like you have to be in two minds. One is there's the agenda, there's the conversation, but then there's also this, what's happening in the room that's not being said, or like what are the dynamics? Do people shut down, or they want to talk about some issue? And one of the things that I think I've become good at is when people can start talking about things that can absorb 45 minutes of an agenda because they're really passionate about something, but they may be down in the weeds. So I have tried to say, hey, that sounds important, but it's really not on the agenda. Or that's something we need to talk about outside of the meeting.
Here's another great question for board chairs or board members. Harder for the senior pastor, CEO, or executive director to ask this question. But when somebody brings up a topic, orange lanyards, thanks for that.
I didn't make the choice.
I know you did it, but it was your, anyway. Somebody needs to ask the question, should we be talking about this? That's not, we shouldn't be talking about this, but it gives the board the pause to go, oh, you're right, that's out of our, we should not be getting in the weeds. Or 3 board members go, I think that's really important. Okay, now we gotta talk. But if a board member brings up a topic, real easy, should be talking about it.
And it may be what you're talking about, Paul, is sort of on page 5 and we're only on page 2.
Yeah.
And almost always they'll go, oh, yeah. So that gives you permission to go back to the agenda and take whatever that was and put it in a parking lot or put it on the other part. You may or may not even get to it during that meeting. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you said about it's like senior pastor and chair of the board, super relationship. What about the rest of the staff and the board?
Oh. I was going to kind of get to that a little bit here too. Again, I'm a policy-based governance guy, right? Which means the board has one employee. One employee. For me, it's the president. For church, it would be a senior pastor, or unless they designate somebody else, right? That's the only person that the board speaks to as a board. Now, for me, I do bring my leadership team into the meetings. They sit in the back of the room at separate tables, not at the same table. They don't speak unless I ask them to speak. The board never speaks to them in a meeting. Now, we do some gathering, they get to know, but there is no contact between board members and staff members. There's some committee work that the board has to do for the board, that our treasurer, CFO works with them, but they are not her boss in that. They're never the boss of anybody other than one person. Otherwise, it's really messy. I was talking to one of our friends that we talked with this one church. He hired an executive pastor, and the 2 of them report to the board directly. I'm like, oh man, I don't see that happening. I don't know
That's
how
challenging.
a board has 2 bosses.
That's challenging.
Yes, and so the board's got to decide, is it the senior pastor that they want to be talking to, or is it the executive pastor? I challenge them to consider that option, because if this is the person running everything, that's probably who the board needs to be talking to. But man, that would be a challenge for a congregation, right? To have a board, not the senior pastor report to the board.
I think about it like an hourglass.
Yeah.
Board is the sand in the top, the CEO is like what actually comes through. And you'll have staff members that are always going to ask you about what's happening at the board meeting. It may or may not be their business. There may be things that are confidential, can't reveal to them. And so your staff, your volunteers, your publics, and that, you're kind of a shield sometimes between the 2 as well.
With that comment, would you also say, so we're about to charter a church, but we have like 200 people already. Me as pastor, you are saying that one of them has to be head pastor though. You can't just have duties divided out.
It's super challenging.
Quarterbacks, they have no quarterbacks.
That's
It's challenging. I've seen it done and done well, The problem is, it's probably based on those two personalities.
Yeah.
And what happens when one leaves, or one goes rogue, or whatever, right? Are you gonna fire one of them and keep the other one there? It's real challenging. I want to talk this real quickly, because we talk about building trust.
Can you hold that?
Sure.
Question?
I was just gonna say that we have, so I'm parish and preschool administrator and pastor, and we both go to the board. So we both do a report to the board, and we are policy-based governance.
You do a report to the board.
We do a report to the board.
Is the board your boss?
That's kind of, in my opinion, it's different, but again, I'm coming into it after it was already developed.
So I want to talk about reports, because I
Go
think
ahead.
that the way the staff and the board interact is through either written reports, or sometimes I will bring a staff member in. We kind of an education piece. Every board meeting has a staff member spending 45 minutes giving a report, and then telling stories, and then answering questions. What I tell them all the time is, when you write a report for the board or speak to the board, your main job is to build confidence in the board. You build confidence in the board by being transparent, by talking about what's happening, by building trust, and that's their whole job. As they meet with them in social settings, build confidence. Staff did not go to the board with problems. If I had a staff member who called up a board member and said, we got a problem with our science department, that staff member would be in my office so fast and probably gone the next day. Maybe not the next day, but pretty quickly, because that's a violation of staff-board relations. That's major policy and policy-based governance. The board has one employee.
I pulled, did you come?
I did, and really,
Okay.
this is key. And it takes years to build and can get destroyed in one meeting. Truthfully, this is a line I've been walking for about 18 months, very, very closely with my board. And when you talk about really important issues, that there's differing opinions, and that underneath part of the iceberg gets to show itself a lot, you've got to always be thinking, what am I doing to build confidence in the organization, right? In my own leadership, and in being able to deliver what the board keeps asking for.
So it's about quarter after. What, I think we didn't go down those, but I think we went over the list. What seems most valuable for you? What's something you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. This is something I want to take back. Best thinking right now. Yes.
Having policy for church councils, I mean, we have bylaws, but I don't think there's any policy. And I think that's crucial.
Okay, great. Others?
Can we see the 7 Gs?
Oh, okay.
You can't tease them, Brian.
I know.
I'm trying to write them down. Seen about that 6 times.
I
Lois.
have one more thought, based on the preschool report lady. When you have a church with a parochial school, the principal then you're saying is also under the pastor.
In policy-based governance, that would be true. And it can get really dicey sometimes, doesn't it? Trust me, those of you who have schools and churches together, it's a mess. It's messy. It doesn't have to be a mess. And it works great when the people get along and do their jobs really, really well. And it goes to hell in a handbasket when somebody doesn't behave well. And I would challenge any organization that has that to think deeply. I'd get a consultant to come in and work with you to really make sure that that structure is in place that allows for good behavior to do all these things rather than work against them. Good point.
So, okay, I'll go around the wheel in 60 seconds or less. So, by the way, this is observations of having worked at a university. I was a senior VP at Wheat Ridge Ministries for more than 10 years and self-employed for, 17 years or something like that. And these are my observations about the most effective boards that I work with. One is they govern well. Where are their bylaws, where are their policies, are they following them? And part of the board's job is to govern itself
Right.
and improve itself. Generative. are you, as the CEO of the senior pastor, are you engaging them? They have like this powder keg of talent and commitment and passion and love for the Lord. Are you engaging them, or are they just listening to reports? So are you engaging them in ways that help you?
When it comes, real quick, most of you probably have boards where somebody comes and gives reports verbally. Don't. There's no need to have the person write it out, send it ahead of time. And then you say, any questions? And if they have no questions, you move on. If they haven't read it, that's their issue. But I would write reports, send it to them.
And some groups do what they call consent agendas.
Yeah.
All that stuff ends
Best
up,
practice.
read it ahead of time, we're going to vote once, accept it all, blah, blah. Those are called board meetings, B-O-R-E-D, board meetings. So anyway, okay. Generative. Give. Now, I don't mean just money. Money's maybe important, but time, connections, expertise, reputation, all the things that you could put into the resource, what's valuable for the organization. So are they giving? Are they getting? You have a gala, and so you want to fill all the tables. Or it's time to really, we need to add 3 more people to the council. Are they out there using their own social capital to say, wait a second, I know her, I know him. Because what this recruiting of start with what, then who. The third one is who's going to go ask. If you really want somebody, send somebody to ask them that they cannot say no to. So that's important to use that social capital and relationship to get the right people on the committee. Go. I was working with a homeless shelter in Chicago a couple years ago, and they had a new person on the board who said, I've never been to one of our intake centers. And I'm like, well, how can this person tell his story about the organization? So take off your board hat, put on your volunteer hat, go down and serve for a weekend and find out what actually happens. So go. So you've got your own passionate story to tell about.
Do not let what he just said slip by. Put on your volunteer hat and put on your board hat. Those are 2 different roles, right? And again, it gets really messy in a church sometimes because that's kind of the whole thing. But in organizations, we want our board members to volunteer, but they don't get to go volunteer and then come back and bring all their gripes to the board because of their bad experience.
Yeah.
So I don't have board members volunteer a lot. That's where you get real messy.
You almost need board training about that.
That's right,
So, yeah.
you really do.
Get off the board if you have term limits. And usually, I don't mean like kick people off the board. I've been serving on a board, this was some years ago, and then my life situation changed, and I just wasn't a good board member anymore. And I felt guilty about it. They knew I wasn't serving at a high level, and so when I resigned, I felt better, and they probably did too, even though they, didn't say that. So, and if you have a board member or council member that's acting up and acting out, you may need, as a board chair, and you may need to have a hard conversation with them and say, this is the field we have to play in, and ask them to leave. So yes.
Any thoughts on how long a board member should be on? Like 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, it just depends.
Yes, but
everybody does it different. It's best practices for you. There are best practices.
Every context is different.
Every context.
Yeah. And
Well, I just had that conversation with somebody today. Yep.
It's horrible when a great board member terms out.
Yeah.
And it's also wonderful when you have somebody who's a big pain in the rear and they term out.
Yep.
And you can just give a plaque and say thanks for being here for 6 years or whatever.
I want to say this before we finish. Being on a board is one of the greatest opportunities ever. We, as leaders, we have to present it that way. We have to give them this option, this space in which they get to bring their whole self. And they see that what they give. It is, if you were in the other board session at this time with Kurt Sensky, he would say to you, your board should be a strategic advantage to your organization. And he would talk about how you make them a strategic advantage, not a strategic deficit. And so, love your board. If you're a leader, love your board. If you're a board member, love your work on the board and love your leader. Find a way to give everything you've got, at least during that time, right? I want my board members leaving meetings exhausted and charged up at the same time. Because I know they're going to leave and forget about it. What I do love, my favorite, one board member who's been with me for 7 years now, pretty much on Saturday morning or Sunday afternoon, I'm going to get a long email from him. Because his drive from Austin to Fort Worth gave him time to think. And it's always both encouraging and challenging. And he may not say a lot at the board meetings, but that email 2 days later, priceless.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question of the group? Just because, so does anyone have good policy, like written down, that you'd be willing to share? I'm generally like this, like I've never seen one.
Situation or congregation situation?
Congregational situation.
Yes.
Al just did one.
Okay, Al, would you be willing to like? I mean, again, like I don't think I've ever seen.
Email in the chat for this meeting on the woo-hoo-ha.
Les and Daryl back here, part of Cornerstone, these guys could also point you to great policy, I believe, as well, or some resources along that way.
A good consultant will help you write the right policy that you need for your organization.
I'm not a policy expert. So, by the way, I didn't talk about this. You know, when you go to look for that next great council member or board member, you know, Ephesians 3, more than we could ever ask or imagine by the power that the Holy Spirit gives us, you know, to God be the glory for that. But, you know, think about just what's happening at this place these few days. There must be 1,000 ministries represented here.
Oh, right.
Of congregation, education, special ed, hunger, housing, ministry, evangelism. I mean, the power, I mean, if you were to pull the nonprofit world, the faith-based world away from what's happening, I can't imagine the fabric that adds to what happens around our globe, and the power of that and the importance of that. So you want to look for people who have the spirit in them of like, you know, God's already, you know, spoke the universe into existence and then had the audacity to say, here's the keys. Now you drive this thing. We haven't done a real good job of it.
Let me. I want to come back to this Bible-based. I would posit that boards doing really good work as boards, what we've all talked about, is actually Bible-based. It is vocation ministry for them. And so it's not about whether you start with a Bible verse or a prayer. It's not about whether you talk about Jesus a lot of times. It is about doing the hard work of a board that really, I believe, makes it Bible-based. God has called you to that role, that vocation for a time. You better be doing a darn good job as a board and as a leader with the board.
God bless you all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.